Thanks, Barry, for that wonderful introduction. So, as Barry mentioned, I've been invited to talk to you. I think this is about the fourth occasion that the WTG has invited me to come and do talks at their event. Despite my best efforts on previous occasions, they do keep inviting me back. The subject of this morning's talk is around managing operations, warehouse operations during periods of change and periods of growth, which I think many businesses are starting to see more of. A couple of years ago when I first did a talk, it was all about coming out of recession and what sort of developments were taking place in warehouses after a period of sort of a lack of investment. The theme largely around today in many respects is around e-commerce and the changes in warehousing due to migration really from fulfillment of maybe high street type operations through to e-commerce. So there's a bit at the end of the presentation which will focus much more on sort of the factors to take into account when you're making those sorts of changes. Most of the rest of the presentation is really around managing change in live operations with as much structure and robustness as possible to avoid any mishaps. If you've got any questions as we go along or anything that's particularly pertinent, please just stick your hand up and we'll take questions as we go along to try and sort of keep it a little bit more interesting than just listening to me for 30 minutes. So, bit of background. Many businesses, not all, but many businesses are now experiencing a period of reasonably sustained growth over the last 2 to 3 years. That's certainly our experience at Hatmill in terms of the clients that we're dealing with. Lots of organisations, through lack of investment through sort of late 2000s, are now having to spend money on either on infrastructure or new properties to cope with volume increases in their business. Most distributors, certainly retailers, are either well into dealing with e-commerce at the moment or have a fast-growing digital channel. There's some data in this afternoon's presentation that shows how that's starting to switch and where we are in terms of the proportion of amongst retailers fulfillment to the high street and to an e-commerce digital channel. We're roughly at around about 15% of all retail fulfillment is via an e-commerce channel. 85% remains high street. Varies a little bit by product group and sector. White goods tend to be a bit higher. And because of that development and that change, many of you, I would imagine, are sort of playing around and toying with how do you change your warehouse operations in order to cope with that change in picking. So maybe an increase in picking singles rather than cases, a change in the order structure and the format of a typical order where it might have been building a pallet previously or something in slightly more bulk. You're now doing far more individual orders with maybe one, 2, 3 items in, maybe an average sort of a hit rate in terms of maybe about 1.6 items per order, which then really changes the dynamics of how you have to manage your team in your warehouse picking those orders, but also maybe changing the way you lay out your structure in the warehouse to minimise travel distance and so forth. So what we're going to focus on are 2 real types of investment. One is sort of developing existing infrastructure, so changing the format and shape and the racking or whatever and how your existing warehouse works, but also quite a few clients we've got at the moment are developing new warehouses or moving into new properties to cope with a lack of space at the moment and just having to increase pure square footage. So how should we manage change within warehouse operations? Largely it's the same way as we should manage change in any other business critical element. I don't think anyone would venture into an IT project and just switch onto a new IT system without doing thorough detailed testing, prototyping and things like that. But in warehousing, that doesn't always seem to be the case. It's certainly not the norm to do that level of rigour. And it's something that sort of puzzles me a little bit in terms of the clients that we deal with. And really, I started to think, well, why don't we manage changes in warehousing with as much structure? And I think the number one reason I see in clients of ours is, as I sort of present to boards or we sit down with the board and talk about the changes that's required and the investment required, all of a sudden everyone in the boardroom is an expert in logistics. Whether you're the sales director, all of a sudden they've got a really great view on how you should lay a warehouse out, and they're not the best people to listen to when it comes to managing warehouse layouts. The marketing director has the finance director. Everyone's got a viewpoint because it's simple, isn't it? It's really simple running warehouses. Yeah, it's just a few boxes in and boxes out. It's not rocket science. I hear pretty much every week. And I think those of you in the audience who are responsible for managing warehouse operations will know, okay, maybe it's not rocket science, but it's easy to cock it up. If you're not diligent, you're not focused in on your processes, and you're not sort of really on the ball every single day. You know, there are people out there who, in your operation who, with the best will in the world and wanting to do the best job they can, will cock orders up, will mess things up, and you've got to be on the ball and focused on that. And I think there's a lack of understanding in the wider business of actually how complex managing logistics operations are. The other point, I think, is the consequences of it going wrong are not well understood either. So the view of logistics amongst the boardroom is, well, you know, that's what we pay the warehouse to do. You know, it should just work. We fire orders into it, and those items should go out in the way. You know, don't expect a pat on the back just for doing your job in terms of what you're paid for. That's the expectation. When it goes wrong, all of a sudden, all the focus is on well, how can this possibly happen? Well, let me explain how it can happen. You've given me no investment in the last 2 or 3 years. I've told you the warehouse management system's creaking. I've told you my RF data, the guns are dropping out and they've got 10-second delay when everyone's going out and picking the orders. And you've done nothing about it. You've not supported me in terms of the investment that we needed in the warehouse. And then the rest of the business is stood there wondering why nothing's going out of the warehouse for 2 days, because actually it's become quite a catastrophic failure. And then the final point I want to mention is the impact of poor communication is underestimated. So quite often people who are managing change in a warehouse operation or in transport operation will lock themselves away in a small room with some of their key people, some of the people they rely on to do a really good job day in, day out, and they don't involve the wider group. You know, so they don't involve enough sort of guys who are the order pickers to see what their viewpoints are and involve them in the development, which is great development for warehouse operatives on the whole. But the wider group you can involve, or as wide a group you can involve as possible, it really tends to deliver some benefits because they will have observations and insights that you as a management team just don't have. So how do we counteract this sort of range of challenges? Again, back to sort of my initial comment really, it's the same way that we deal with any sort of major business change. We need a clear project management structure. That means actually having a structure and someone having written it down on a piece of paper so everyone knows who's doing what and who's responsible for what. We need a clear project or the clear identification of a project manager and the owner of the project. So I'm always astonished, certainly typically in more of larger organisations when there's a major change, and you know, maybe they'll hit a problem and we'll be invited in. We'll then say, well, who's responsible for the project? And there's sort of a silence, and there's some glances round, and sort of someone will then sort of, well, I suppose it's me. And it's just astonishing then actually, how can you set out on a project without knowing who's on point and who's responsible for making the changes and who does the accountability lie with? And it just happens over and over again. Linked to that project manager, it's essential to have a board level sponsorship. So actually, who is accountable at board level for making the change? Who is there to escalate the issues and get the buy-in from finance or whatever during the project and make sure that everyone's aware at board level that things are happening so it's appropriately supported by the wider business. Having a clear business case for change, because if you want people to allocate funds to development, you've got to be clear on what the benefits are going to be. It's no point just going, well, we're going to save £1 million. Great, how have you got to that? So having some really good detailed, being clear on your assumptions in your business case so everyone can take their view on whether they think those assumptions are reasonable. Also having very clear in terms of investment costs, whether it's in a budget and then being able to track that budget during implementation to show that whether you're on or off budget. All that stuff needs to be managed, needs to be documented and needs to be communicated. Project initiation document. I don't know how many of you are aware have done project initiation documents before. Anyone? Hands up. Okay. Do you all work at the same place? All right. So project initiation document, probably about 15, maybe 20 pages of a Word document that sets out pretty much a lot of the things on this list. So it's clearly written down, clearly noted. Everyone's signed up to it. It's a circulation list. There's change control over it. It's why we're doing the project, who's responsible for it, who's going to be involved, what other areas of the business are going to be affected, what are the work streams that are going to take place, and who's responsible for the different work streams and activity. All those sorts of things. You can put it in a document, and there's a theme emerging here, I know, in terms of what I'm saying. Good project documentation throughout. Everyone can then pick it up and go, oh, right, great. Because what also happens is when you start off with a good project initiation document, 6 months later, the reason for doing the change has changed because the business has changed and, you know, oh, well, actually, we're not selling that stuff anymore, so you don't need that racking. Right. Well, and then you could draw people back to this and say, well, this is what you signed off. This is what you approved. This is what you approved the budget on the basis of, and this is what I was going to do. So we now need to sit down and recut that and explain why it's changed and what we need to do differently. Otherwise, you're out there, you've committed £500,000 of spend to go and do something, and it's not going to deliver any benefits, and the rest of the business turns around and says, well, why have you spent that? And so unless you have that change control, you're exposing yourself to the risk of having fingers pointed at you for not being in control and not doing the right things to support the business. Project plan. Most projects do have a project plan. They sort of get built at the start and then ignored until we sort of just deliver it whenever we said we were going to, you know, as soon as we can. But project plans are essential to understand, particularly around dependencies. So actually we can't do this until sales have confirmed or marketing have confirmed what our future range is going to be. That's one of the biggest challenges there in itself, getting people, the wider business saying, right, we're going to build a new warehouse. This is going to last, you know, we're going to sign up for a 15-year lease. What's the size of the range going to be? Because that's going to dictate my number of pick faces. Well, we can't tell you that. No one can predict the future. Right, that's not particularly helpful on the basis you're going to sign up to a 15-year lease of 500,000 square feet, give or take. And we, you know, we have a lot of dialogue and cycling round in terms of that, trying to get people to commit to a clear plan, because very few businesses can see sort of beyond the next 12 months. Risk and issue log. So, you know, what are the risks? And I get people who've not worked in this way before. Well, what's the difference between a risk and an issue? A risk is something that might happen, that we should be thinking about and be aware of. It might be coming down. An issue is something that is happening and we need to be dealing with it. We'll talk about that a little later on. Budget controls and monitoring, I've already talked about. Have that initial budget and update it every project meeting so people are aware of what's changing, what, you know, if we need more spend and why, and what the justification for that is. And then the last point, a bit unusual, but a no fear culture. What tends to happen, and this certainly happens more the bigger the expenditure is on the project, is that when something starts going wrong, and things do go wrong on projects, and it's good to make people aware that things will not all go very smoothly to plan throughout, no matter how much planning you do. But when things do go wrong, what you can't have are project team members who aren't stepping forward and saying, I've got a problem and we need to focus on it. So you've got to have that, there's going to be no fear of sticking your hand up saying, I've got a problem and we need to do something about it. And then the other thing that's linked to that is a fear of delay. So quite often, a project will become entirely obsessed with, we said it was going to go live on the 7th of September. And the 7th of September suddenly becomes this date that's cast in stone. And even on the 5th of September, when you know there's not a cat in hell's chance of it going live on the 7th of September without having any problems, people are going, oh, well, you know, you said the 7th of September. And the thing that always astounds me is that over time on the projects that we work on, if it comes in 2 weeks late, 4 weeks late, 6 weeks late, no one remembers that. No one ever remembers if a project is delivered slightly late, because that's what all projects in all other parts of the business do. What they do remember is when you cut corners to try and hit a date and nothing worked and everything failed for a week or 2 weeks or a month. So don't get caught up in the fear of delay. It's far better to delay and go live successfully than it is to go, we hit the date and then nothing worked. So we've probably done about 6 or 7 different warehouse moves or developments in the last 2.5, 3 years. We learn on every project, so we'll work with clients and we'll bring a hell of a lot of knowledge from previous projects, but there's always some new things that we learn on every project we do. I think the key things are, if you're opening a new warehouse or making significant changes or structural changes, is there are massive opportunities to use that to get rid of old working practices and gain some efficiencies. There's also lots of potential pitfalls, to get caught up in and fall down and cause those problems. There's lots of difficult economic decisions. So you'll be saying, well, actually, if we spend another 200 grand, I think we can increase the pick rate up by 4 points, and that'll pay back in about 2 years. Actually, is that something we want to do? And you've got to sort of there's lots of sort of swings and roundabouts in terms of many aspects around managing those changes. There are also lots of assumptions you've got to make. In many cases, you as sort of logisticians are having to make assumptions for other parts of the business because you can't get them to commit to giving you a clear plan. So when they won't agree to the number of SKUs that you're likely to have in the next 5 years, you have to say, well, actually, I've done this, I think we're going to have 5,000 SKUs. It might be 7,500, which will still be okay. But if it's 10,000, we've got a major problem. I'm just telling you, so the rest of the business, I'm just telling you this so you know, and it's off my shoulders in terms of what we've got to do. So it's understanding why you make those assumptions and the implications of those assumptions. Other lessons. Start early. The earlier you start planning for significant change, the better. Time flies once you're in major change projects. But with 12 months, we don't need to start thinking about it now. In reality, you start looking at the lead times for some of the kit that you see around the warehouse here. You start looking at the sign-off process. Maybe it's got to go to 2 or 3 board meetings. That suddenly wastes a quarter of the year before someone's going to sign something off. The earlier you can start it and the earlier you can raise a red flag about needing to make changes in your operations, the better. Our suggestion is certainly 2 to 3 years before any leases are due to expire, because again that gives you an opportunity, should you, rather than signing an extension, should you be using that opportunity to move or change the situation. And also if you've got a long-term business plan, just as a matter of interest, a show of hands, how many people have who run warehouses have an appreciation or a fixed business plan of the volumes that your business is planning to do in 5 years' time? That's none. It's slightly scary, isn't it? Given that many of you be sat there with the leases running out between now and then, or effectively you've got a commitment in terms of your current infrastructure between now and then. And really, so maybe if there's one takeaway from today, it's to go back to your business and say, what's our business plan for the future? I'd like to do some long-term planning in terms of whether we need to move, whether we need to invest in the warehouse, whether we need to recruit or whatever, just to start getting a bit of a feel for what's going to be expected of you in the future. Because if you don't know what's going to be expected of you in the future, you can't be expected to do a good job either. Other lessons, get an intimate knowledge of your data. So in terms of converting that future turnover into volumes in units, understanding how those units convert into cubic space, certainly around pick faces or storage, understanding stock turn implications, understanding process capacities, so where are the bottlenecks, how many doors do you need, pack benches or whatever. The graph up there is one from a client of ours that we worked with a few years ago, whereby they were saying that there were, I know we've only got a stock turn of 12 at the moment, but by this time next year we think we're going to be turning the stock 24 times a year. It's like, that's great. But how realistic is that? Because what they wanted to do was to base the required amount of space in the warehouse on that stock turn assumption. In reality, I've never known anyone double their stock turn in 12 months unless they're absolutely appalling. But the impact of that was they needed 30,000 square feet less. In the end, it's a world of compromises. They went for 10,000 square feet more than the minimum that they said, and 12 months later, they'd gone back into outside storage. So it's really about understanding how realistic are these assumptions, and who's convincing, and where does the power sit in terms of that element. Operating costs. Certainly if you think about going to a brand new warehouse, what often happens in terms of the location decision, people get caught up and hooked on what's the cost per square foot. And particularly if you're moving sort of significant distances around the country, the main, I would suggest your focus really should be on prevailing labour rates and where you would sit in terms of that range of labour rates to get good quality people into your warehouse operation. It should also be focused on your transport costs and how they're going to change, because what will happen is, as you put that into a total volume of total operating costs, the cost per square foot tends to pale into insignificance depending on how labour intensive your warehouse operation is. But people get, oh, that's 25p a square foot cheaper. Well, yeah, but you know, there's no layer. If you go into somewhere like Lutterworth or around Daventry, you've got this nomadic workforce that will just keep relocating and moving from one business to another for an extra 10 pence per hour. Do you really want that, or do you want to go somewhere where actually you can build a good consistent labour force which are, you know, aren't necessarily nomadic and are loyal to your business, that you can really develop and grow with? So really have that focus on the wider costs. Talked about the opportunities to improve. It gives you a massive opportunity to improve your operation. So you know, map your processes as they are at the moment, involve the wider group as wide a sort of number of operators and things as you can, as practical, and look at how can you re-engineer what you do. So if we're moving to a new site, all these problems that, you know, we've moaned about for the last 10 years about, oh, I can't do that, I can't do that. That's the time to get all those on the table and go, right, it's a new world, it's a blank sheet of paper, what are we going to fix? How are we going to set this up to match our needs from the off? Make sure you clearly document those changes and make sure you clearly manage that change through. So if you are keeping, you know, the same group of people going from one site to another, be prepared for 6 months of, well, we never used to do it that way. Well, yeah, that's right, we didn't. But there's a good reasons why we're now doing it in this way. So make sure you've communicated that change and trained it in fully. Don't expect people just to adopt new ways of working with very little guidance or instruction. Any changes that you are making, make sure you test them thoroughly. So one of the things that we always encourage clients to do is create a test room. So you book out a fairly big meeting room and lay it out a bit like a warehouse. You don't need to put racking in and things, but you have different stuff on different tables in terms of goods in terms of pick faces, reserves and outbound. Barcode it all, get some empty boxes and just walk through the processes if you're changing your WMS or whatever. Far easier to do that in a meeting room and understand where the issues are than it is to do it in a live environment when you've got 25 people stood around going, well, what do you want us to do? And you're saying, actually nothing at the moment, go and sweep up for a while we try and fix the WMS or whatever. You know, that thorough testing is really important. Some points on testing. Test scripts. So these are lists of processes and things that you would work through. But the other thing about a test script is it's got an outcome. So it's, well, when we do this, what do you expect to see? Do you expect to see it? Great, tick. It just creates that understanding in terms of what should be happening in terms of the overall operation. Test everything. Don't think anything, take anything for granted. So make sure all your processes and systems and documentation all has a dry run, and don't sort of take shortcuts in terms of using people who don't know what they're doing. Sorry, don't take shortcuts in terms of the team that you're going to use. Use people who know what they're doing, but similarly, use people who don't know what they're doing. So actually, you know, bring a brand new starter in or someone who doesn't really understand the operation and get them to work through the new process, because they'll ask the questions, they won't make assumptions, they'll be doing the classic sort of 4-year-old trick of just saying why 5 times until you get to an answer of why something is set up in the way it's set up, and you'll learn lessons from doing that. Make a note of what doesn't work, put it into your issue log and work through a structured process to resolve it. In terms of communicating change, very few people have much experience of interpreting plan drawings from architects or racking providers and understanding what the implications of that are and being able to transfer that into their world of walking around a real warehouse. So one of the things that we do, and we do it in a fairly simplistic way, and you can use this as a free piece of software called Google SketchUp, and you can pretty quickly learn how to use that and draw some fairly quick block diagrams, a bit like this one here, that convert a warehouse plan into a 3D plan. And once you do that, you can then spin it around, rotate it, and then you can do sort of walkthroughs. So you can then get it on a big screen in a meeting room and bring some of your warehouse ops and say, right, this is what we're planning on doing. Let me just take you through some of the ideas and where everything's going to work, and it sort of creates that sort of simulation of what the new warehouse is going to be. And it's then that you get the great questions of, well, what about when we do that every third Tuesday of the month? And those sort of little nuances that every warehouse operation has. That's when those things will come out, that you can make those adaptations and changes to the design. So project management, if you've managed to get your business invested, send you on a Prince 2 course or whatever, it's a 5-day course. It tells you a ton of stuff you don't need to know, in my view. But you do tend to come away with probably about a good 6 or 7 lessons that you will be able to implement and get some benefit from. Don't necessarily, anyone here from the public sector? Don't run projects like the public sector do, because they'll insist on print and fill in all the documentation. So there's use the practical tools and get them to work for you. So link to the previous slide, ensure design changes are made early. Far cheaper to change it when it's on a piece of paper rather than when it's in metal. Chase progress, so you'll have other work streams where you're wanting people to bring information and confirm things to the project. Hold people to account if they're not doing that. Escalate it. Feel free to go and make a song and dance about it within the business if people are letting your project down. Just don't treat it with a level of apathy. You need to get onto these people because they're holding you back. Budget control we've spoken about. Risk and issue logging and tracking. It might be quite dull to go through that each week, but there'll be something in there that you will resolve that will save you having a problem at go live. And in the same way of buying a property is all about location, managing projects is all around communication to everyone. Make sure create a communication plan where you list all the people in your organisation and how you're going to communicate to them and how frequently and what the content needs to be of that, and follow that plan. One of the final points I'd like to make is try and avoid going live in a big bang. People go, oh no, we're going to be, it's fine, we've done all the testing. We'll just switch it over and we'll close here on Friday, we'll open there on Monday, we'll be fine. It's rare that ever happens. No matter all the diligence, even if you do all the diligent stuff that we've just talked about, or I've just talked about, you've not said very much. It's rare that a big bang will actually happen in a successful way. So plan to ramp it up, plan to just do one order to begin with, then 10 orders, and just ramp it up and learn those lessons as you go along. There will still be tweaks that you will need to make post go live to make it a success. Just focus now to do that sort of bit on sort of managing change successfully and managing warehouse project change. Just linking this now into e-commerce in a particular way. Some of the things that I guess many of you might be toying with at the moment. So duplication of pick faces. Should we stick to our original sort of pick layout, which might be picking cases, and then just break a pack open and pick singles out of it? Is that a sensible way? Or do we set up an entirely new layout where we actually just hold a single case or a couple of cases and pick singles out of that area? There's a number of factors I'll talk about this afternoon on that. Travel distance versus number of pick face hits. So if you've got a large warehouse and you're going out and you're picking 1.6 items per e-commerce order, you've got a hell of a lot of travel time built into that journey to pick very little volume, which will massively increase your cost per order. There's an interesting truck over there that Toyota have built in with a sort of a step ladder type arrangement on the back of it, which is for picking e-com orders where you've got 4 shelves to pick 4 orders at a time and a step-up facility. There's a number of things out there in the marketplace that help increase the number of orders picked per picking journey that can help improve that pick efficiency. Division of labour between picking and packing. Businesses that have generally picked sort of high street replen orders have used to the warehouse ops going out, picking the order, dropping it in the accumulation lanes near the doors or whatever, and off doing their own thing. What I tend to see is people who are sort of migrating into that early doors is that someone will go and pick an order and then the same person will then take it to a pack bench and start packing it. It's far more efficient to have pickers and packers and do that handover. it also gives you that extra check or in terms of accuracy, because you rarely get a picker who will check back on their own accuracy because they'll just assume they did it right the first time when they're doing a pack of an order. Managing the cut-off rush, so how the big thing in terms of everyone trying to, how late can we cut off an order to give a quick turnaround. Understanding your customer behaviour in terms of how that might peak as it comes into a 6 p.m. cut-off or whatever is also essential to know. So can you cope with that, and is there a ceiling on the amount of volume per hour you can cope with, and understand, so clearly understand what that ceiling is and manage that in terms of how achievable is a particular cut-off time if that volume is going to increase as you offer to improve service. Linked to that in terms of next point is knowing your hourly capacity limit. There is a limit in terms of what you can get out per hour. You don't want to be making promises to your customers or indeed to your business that you can't keep. Managing labour across the day links to that as well. Understanding time critical and non-time critical tasks. So as you link to that sort of cut-off time, understanding should you still be doing some goods in and put away during that period when actually you want everyone to be picking, and what sort of MHE do you need. So it's really understanding how do you migrate your labour pool around the time critical tasks to make sure that there's no one doing things that don't need to be done if the warehouse is up against it. Model the processes to understand costs. Talk about that a little bit this afternoon in terms of there's a big desire to go on. The world's panacea is e-commerce. There's many businesses out there who are starting to recognise, yes, it's a way you've got to be in e-commerce to maintain and drive volume, but you're making far less margin on a net profit basis because of the excessive logistics costs that go in around delivery, around picking, around returns. So actually understanding your full cost to serve is something we'll touch on this afternoon. And then sort of model those volume flows through your processes. So build it doesn't have to be too complex, but a reasonable sort of spreadsheet that takes you through actually what's our volume per hour, what sort of labour will we need to cope with all those processes as we change to a different way of working. You might be surprised in terms of how much more labour you need to cope with an e-com operation compared to a high volume store replenishment operation. Any questions so far?